Charles, you're involved in a program called You the People here in Russia. Can you tell us about it?
Well, sure. It was kind of a mistake. I started out to fix the democratic deficit in the United States, and then apparently Mr. Putin, on the way to being president, formed this little group here in St. Petersburg, an intelligentsia group based in the university. And he told them, hey, we've been trying what the West has told us for 9 years, and it hasn't worked. Find somebody who can teach us democracy. So they proceeded to research every website in the world. I didn't believe them until I got here and find out about the Russian mentality that purports to teach democracy. And they invited us all. I got this weird email that said, hello, I represent the non-governmental organizations of Northwest Russia. Mm-hmm. We're unhappy with what your government calls democracy. We would like to be a nation of, by, and for the people. Can you help us? You can just imagine. Here I am drinking coffee in Tacoma, Washington, just getting up, and I get this damned email. So that led to about 6 months of negotiations, and finally I said, okay, I'll come, I'll give it a shot.
So where did you take it from there?
Well, I paid my money and I went to came here to St. Petersburg. And when I got here, I was a little bit concerned because I thought to myself, well, gee, these guys could throw me in the Neva River and nobody would be any the wiser. And son of a gun, there was my picture at the, and I came out from security, my picture from my website all blown up and on a stick. Mm-hmm. And it was all downhill from there. They took me in, they tested me for about a year here in St. Petersburg, gave me a school to show them, deliberately exactly what I was going to do and how I was purporting to teach democracy.
Mm-hmm. And how were you purporting to teach it?
Well, just the same way I do it in the United States, which is by experiential learning, where you get together in a little process that I invented that's just a democracy in miniature. And so whatever you're doing, you're learning democracy. And so that turned out to be really great later in the process because they said, okay, go for it. And they said, we want you to build us a program that teaches our people, meaning the entire Russian population, this thing is huge, what your people learned between 1620 and 1775 that made your revolution successful where others failed. Oh my God.
Okay. And what was the content of that future program?
Then I just took my little process and I went up to Karelia where they put me to keep me out of the eyes of the West and make it a pure Russian program. And the Minister of Education gave me free rein. I could do whatever I wanted. And so we started in the schools. We started in grade 1 and building a program. First I had to teach the teachers. That was the big challenge because this thing requires them to get off the platform and quit being the sage on the stage, as we call them in the United States, and letting the students start to take responsibility for their own education. And boy, it's magic when you do that. It's amazing what happens.
How do you get the students to take responsibility for their own education?
Well, you put them in these little groups. And the groups are deliberately chosen by the teacher by diversity of thought, not diversity of color or skin or sex or any of that, but diversity of thought. We put the banker together with the astronaut, together with the future lawyer, together with the homemaker, different types of thinking. Because when you do that, magic happens and you get really much better decisions from the group than you would get from any one person. Mm-hmm. And so the teacher in every single classroom picks the groups and they stay in those groups for the whole year. They don't change. Those groups, too bad. You get in a fight in that group, fix it. No getting out of it and trading off and getting a divorce.
Right. So what kind of subjects would this course require?
Well, that was the thing where the fact that it's just a process and anything you flow through it will teach democracy, because the minister said she didn't want to have a curriculum because that would make a big fight. It's because something then has to get kicked out of the school curriculum for this portion to be substituted. So what we did was we did it so that you can do it in math, you can do it in music, you can do it in art, you can do it, and we created about 500 lesson plans that do that. And so it's once a week, instead of the normal music class where the teacher stands there and does whatever she does, the group process takes over. And they have then planned that. They've been working for a week using, again, this little democratic process that, if they disagree, they have to take a vote on it, and majority rules, and little things like that. Plus, there's 7 citizenship skills that they have to use that I got from the preamble to the Constitution. And they have to use those, and they have to evaluate themselves that they did use those.
What are the 7 citizenship rules?
They're cooperation, patience, fairness, respect, strength, self-improvement, and balance. And I got them from the preamble. It says we the people, not we the persons.
Right.
So we have to learn to cooperate.
Do Russians learn these qualities differently from Americans?
Yes, very. One of the problems we found, and one of the big discussions we had about it in the first 6 months, was about 4 of these words don't mean the same in Russian as they do in English, not even close.
What 4 words?
Patience, for instance. Patience in Russian is rooted in a word that means wait till the Tsar dies.
Oh.
And of course, patience in the Western sense is, okay, you wait your turn, but when it's your turn, you go. And so I have to teach what I call active patience to the Russian kids, because it's not in their culture. They don't know it.
So they're expecting someone to tell them what to do because that's part of their culture?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember once about, 4 years into the program, which was almost 8 years long. I'm coming and we're having a seminar with a bunch of teachers, and my staff is sitting there, and it's 20 minutes till the seminar. And I go, okay, what's going on? Oh, well, we've made some changes. Okay. Yeah, we're going to put the tea over here, and we're going to use these kind of cookies instead of those kind of cookies. And I said, that's it? Oh, yeah. Okay, I approve. Instant action. Boom, boom, boom. But until I said yes as the boss, nothing happened. And these are PhD and master's degree people.
Well, how do you get people to come from themselves rather than to come from authority?
Well, that's just it. That was the challenge, and that's what I told the teachers. That's what we're trying to teach from the first grade on up. And I want you to design me some lesson plans that will get the kids thinking differently.
And how can I think differently about this?
Yeah, well, like the first grade, my best plan in the first grade was a little thing where they do brain warm-up exercises. The education system here is really good, excellent. I can consider it far better than ours. And anyway, they have brain warm-up exercises for music, for math, and everything before they go into the lesson plan. And this one was draw an ideal place where you would just ideally like to be. So the kids draw a little picture. And then the answer is, okay, now take the things that you're good at, that you feel you're kind of really ideal at, and put them down in pen. And then over here in pencil, put down the things, well, you're not so good at. I kick the dog, I lie a little bit, blah, blah, blah. And then they spend the rest of the semester with their peers working on, for each of them, trying to take at least one of those pencil marks and being able to erase it and put it over here in pen. Well, that's revolutionary in Russia.
Yeah.
That takes responsibility for self. It says that self is an individual. It says that self can change and become better. And so it just, again, for a whole semester they do that. And every little kid has to agree that before this kid erases the pencil, the other kids in the group have to agree, yep, you're good. You can do that. So she can't just, oh, well, I'm good now. No, you can't do that. It's totally done on peer group pressure.
It seems like the process that you're teaching people here in Russia is so different from what they're used to that there might be some resistance to it.
I thought so too, and about, a couple of months into the program, I arrived at the school where in those days we had our office and we also taught. It was started in one school and then spread out. And they said, well, the parents showed up last night. And I go to myself, okay, here we go, And they said, no, it's not that. No, they want you to design a mini course in this and have little night classes in it so that they can come and learn what you're trying to do so that they can help their kids get a good grade.
What strikes me about all this is that you've been invited to Russia to teach Russians about an American system about how America does things, and yet when I hear you talk about the system that you're offering them, it seems to me that it would be also appropriate to teach in American schools, and I don't know of any American school that teaches this kind of learning.
Well, it's interesting because I went because Washington doesn't teach civics and citizenship, and neither do 32 other states. Turns out California teaches it as an elective.
Oh, really?
So I ended up going to Sacramento and talking to a girl named, oh my gosh, I've forgotten her name, Belle, I believe. Anyway, Diane was her first name. Anyway, wonderful woman. She was the social studies coordinator for the state of California. And she took a look at this thing and tried it out in a couple of schools and had me back a few months later and said, "This is the best social studies program I've ever seen." She said, the problem is it'll take me about 10 years to get the school systems ready for it because it's so revolutionary. She says it changes the whole concept of education.
Right. So the period of time that you're dealing with in American history from which our present system arises, what were the years again?
Oh, it was 2001.
No. You said that pre-revolutionary.
Oh, 1620 to 1775,
Yeah.
which is 150 years.
Yeah.
And during that time, and I hadn't thought of it this way until the Russians mentioned it, and then I put my thinking cap on and I said, oh, I've taken colonial history and American history and British history, but all as separate pieces. They're not separate at all. You know, during that time frame, they were one and the same. And during the 1600s, the Brits were completely in disarray. You know, Oliver Cromwell killed the king, restoration of the king, tremendous upheavals. So they didn't have time for their colonies. So what that forced the colonists here in the United States to do is to get self-reliant and independent, develop individuality, get away from that depend on the king mentality. And so they were ready for democracy when the time came.
So you're reminding people of the values that this country was based on that may have forgotten.
Exactly. That's what I started out to do. And the Russians saw those values and said, well, that's what we need. We don't need the democracy of Bush and Clinton. We need the democracy of Washington, Madison, and Jefferson.
But these values arose, shall we say, naturally from the American condition, and therefore we can say that it's part of the American condition. But since these values did not arise naturally from the Russian condition, aren't we imposing values that are foreign on another culture?
Yes, we are, and deliberately. And the Russians asked me to do it, because as they say, no, without a people who have these values, no democracy is possible. If they're constantly out there, looking for a strong man. And that was the problem, when we first held elections here in Russia in the 90s, boy, they got out there, it was a full, free, and fair election. Let me tell you, the campaign was no holds barred. And then they elected the guy, and then the next day, all the factions are there in front of the city hall going, okay, boss, what do you want us to do?
Right. Charles, how long have you been involved with Russia?
Oh gosh, 15 years now.
And what changes have you seen?
Tremendous changes. I mean, just incredible growth and in every aspect. But they still have a tremendous, long way to go in two areas. Because when I came here, I found out that the education system was really super. And when you can talk nuclear physics to a Russian, and he's got it. But when you talk politics, his knowledge drops to zero. And economics, because those weren't allowed to be taught during the Soviet years. You taught Marx,
Right.
and you taught communism. You didn't teach the real concept of economics or the real concept of politics. It was all propaganda on both sides.
You've been traveling with Sharon Tennyson's group for about 2 weeks now. What's been your impression of what you experienced as a result of being in her group?
Oh, well, this was wonderful. It's only a start, mind you, but I think it's a good template, and we've all discussed, some spin-offs that we can foresee helping this process of getting a people-to-people thing going to counter the animosity between our governments.
Why is there animosity between our governments?
I'll go at it. Well, there's two sides, of course. From the American side, I think that it's just a remembrance because we were so drilled into bad Russia, during the Cold War, that those people who were brought up in that bad Russia are now our congressmen and now our, people in the State Department and stuff, and it's in their subconscious thinking that Russia's automatically bad, somehow. Because the American people, of course, don't particularly think of Russia as bad. But from the Russian side, it's very logical. Whereas the main thing was they were promised that we would not move NATO eastward for 15 years, and then this was the original agreement that caused the Soviets to essentially cancel their empire without firing a shot, which is a huge historic thing that we don't give them credit for. Mm-hmm. Anyway,
you're saying that the Russians are extremely sensitive to protecting their borders?
Oh my God, yes. And if you'd ever read Russian history, you'd know why. I mean, I used to hate Russian history in college because every time I'd read it, I'd get very depressed because some other huge debacle had happened, and killed millions. And I'm going, oh my God, these poor people, it happened again, Mm-hmm. First the Mongols come across, and then the Tatars come across, and then Genghis Khan shows up, and then the German knights come across in the Middle Ages, and every one of them just kills thousands of Russians and lays waste to the place. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it happened again in World War I and World War II. So yeah, they're very, very sensitive to that. And if we didn't have the two great big oceans on either side of us, we'd probably be a lot more sensitive to it too.
Mm-hmm. How can Americans relate empathically to what the Russians feel intrinsically?
Boy, that's tough because we have not, we're so fortunate. I always remember a buddy of mine in Vietnam used to say, boy, I'm the luckiest man in the world. I won the ovarian lottery. I was born in the United States. And it's true. I mean, we've never had, except for the Civil War, we've never had a conflagration like the Russians have had regularly throughout their history. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to be empathetic. But when I came over here and watched, I guess the first time I really, really realized it was when I went to my first Dia of Maya, the first Victory Day, which here is, then you get the feeling that it's deep in the population's psyche. And when you know the fact that they lost 27 million people in World War II, which had to touch every single family. Somebody said to me this morning that if you do the numbers, of the people born in 1921 and 1922 in Russia, only 10% of them survived.
Wow.
So everybody's grandparent has been affected, and so it still touches deep in the Russian psyche.
And Americans have nothing like that in their frame of reference.
No, right. No, we don't.
Yeah, when I decided to come over here with Sharon Tennyson's group, my friends told me, oh my God, you're going into Russia, you've got to be very, very careful. Some people, said that they didn't like Russia, they didn't like Russians, and they didn't like Vladimir Putin. Well, they get these ideas from American media, and I think Americans are, after having spent some time in Russia, I get the impression that American media has not been forthcoming with the truth about what's really going on. Can you address that?
Sure. For one thing, I'm not sure any of them have a reporter stationed here. The American mainstream media, as we call them, is undergoing a huge existential crisis with the internet, and they're getting their budgets cut hugely, big time. So they can't afford to send people overseas and base them there anymore like they used to. So they're depending on their Russian dissident friends to tell them everything that's going on here. And I cynically believe that probably there's a few, like Putin won't play ball with the Wall Street barons, so there's probably a lot of pressure on him to demonize Putin, to get him out of there so that Russia can become a vassal of New York, which Putin refuses to do.
Mm-hmm. And Putin has been demonized. By whom and why?
Well, that's one of the reasons, I think. The other reason is there's three factions that have kind of teamed up. One is the financial community, because Putin refuses to kowtow to him. The other is the neocons, who perceive of the United States as the next British Empire, and do everything they can to put down anybody that is not willing to be a vassal state. And the third is the progressives, who will do anything for votes. And if you diss Russia and have an anti-Russia policy, you get every Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, Hungarian, Ukrainian, whatever, Eastern European vote of people that have come to the United States in the past 50 or 60 years. Because they hate Russia. They hate him.
Why?
And because they were there under communism.
Oh, I see, yes.
And so they learned to hate Russia, and they've passed this on to their American children, first generation children who were born in America, but they don't know anything. They just know what their parents told them.
Charles, we were in Ekaterinburg, and we were with the American Consul General there in his office. And while our group met with him, he told us that, you're the first American group that's ever met with us.
Yeah, I found that fascinating, actually.
Shocking, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, the country's...
Because, the consul is there to welcome Americans and stuff, so I figured, mostly a consul is there to help American businessmen. But apparently there haven't been many American businessmen. Now, maybe that's because Ekaterinburg was Sverdlovsk, and it was a secret city, and it made missiles. So maybe their economy is still based around making military stuff, which would mean there won't be any American businessmen welcome.
Charles, on the basis of your a little bit more than 2 weeks here on this trip with Sharon's group, what would you like Americans to know?
It's a great time to visit Russia. My God, 50 rubles to the dollar, everything's cheap as dirt. And this idea that they have, which they pass to you, and they stopped passing to me a long time ago because they know that I'm stupid, is that it's perfectly safe here. There's absolutely no problems. This is a very orderly, structured, and I might say conservative country. And they don't allow that sort of thing. There's none of this running around and gangs and all that stuff. Yeah, sure, they're here, but boy, they're actively opposed by the police and whatever other in the power structure. And no, you don't do that in Russia. You don't in any way near what you would get in like Paris or Brussels, like the pickpockets on the buses and on the subways there. They're not here in Russia.
Right. Charles, what is your background that's prepared you for this?
Well, nothing. I was a military officer and fought against the Soviet Union for 30 years.
Well, what brought you around?
Well, just coming here. Now, mind you, I learned the education technology because I was involved in the Army education system, which is separate from the other American, the normal American education system, and is extremely effective. Because if our focus in the Army is learning, because if our kids don't learn what we teach them, they have a chance to die on the battlefield. So we make a big deal of it, and it's not education; it's really inculcation of every single thing we want them to teach. We want them to learn. Right. No ABCs. No, you come to a minimum standard, or you go back and do it again.
Right. What one thing would you like to leave our listeners with about your program?
Well, it is very comprehensive. It can be used worldwide. Every guy in Washington that really get the pictures, his eyes light up if he's an old state hand and he goes, South America. Because this thing, what I did is, in a sense, I didn't start out to do this. When I look at it, it takes basic combat training, which most people think of as physical training. No, it's mostly psychological training. What we're doing in the Army, we're trying to take citizens and make soldiers out of them. What I've done here is reverse that process. I'm taking a bunch of soldiers, which is what Russian citizens are. Take orders, boom, and make citizens out of them, so that they individually answer to God and then vote, and they cohere as a group because they want to, not because they're forced to. Right. We're trying to break that collective mentality, and it works. It works great.
How does the government here feel about it? What feedback have you got from them? Have you got feedback from Putin himself?
Yes, very positive. About maybe 2 years into the program, all of a sudden this little guy shows up in one of our seminars, and I asked my Russian head teacher, I said, well, who's that little guy? And she said, we don't know. It's deeply ingrained in the Russian mind. If somebody shows up you don't know, this is not good. And so I met the guy at the break and said, who are you? And he says, oh, I'm President Putin's personal representative on civic education. Okay. And he produces a card to that effect, but I've learned, this is, you can make it card. So I started talking to the guy, and he started talking about stuff that I knew that was top secret, that was about the fall of the Soviet Union, that was really not a fall, it was a negotiated settlement. And he knew about who met who and how it came down. And I did too, because I was in the Pentagon and at NATO at the time. And so I said, okay, this guy's the real McCoy. And so at the end of the day, he says, you're doing the great thing. This is exactly what Russia needs. And he gave me his card, and he says, if anybody gives you any trouble, give me a holler. Give me a phone call.
So the so-called fall of the Soviet Union was a negotiated settlement?
It was a negotiated settlement, yes.
Yeah.
And I learned that too from American sources. A friend of mine was General John Shalikashvili, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he ended up coming back and living a couple of doors down from me in Washington State. And he used to go skiing with us, and with the Rotary group. And so we sat down when we were between ski runs one day, and I asked him, I said, was this true? And he said, oh yes. I met with the chief of the Soviet General Staff, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Okay. Could you talk some more about how it's a negotiated settlement, or is this?
Well, that's right. It was a negotiated settlement. What are you guys going to do if we fold the con? If we just dissolve the Soviet Union? How are you going to treat us? What can we expect? And that's where that thing about the promise, and this was from James Baker, as I understand it, to Gorbachev himself, that we will not move NATO, because that was a real key concern, and still is. People don't understand that, because we perceive NATO as a purely defensive thing. But if you have been against NATO for 50 years, you don't perceive it as a defensive, you perceive it as the enemy. So the Russians perceived NATO as the enemy, and they said, you won't move NATO forward for 15 years. And we said, yes, and then we'll take all of you in together. Russia and the whole Warsaw Pact, the old ex-Soviet Union, would come into NATO together. And that's the origin of the famous speech by Bush called Vancouver to Vladivostok, older Bush. And that was the policy of the United States. And we blew it.
Yeah. In the current crisis with Ukraine, what is it that Americans just don't get?
They don't get, as I like to put it to my friends, what if Putin had, if the Russians had spent millions of dollars fomenting a coup in Mexico, put in their own guy as president, joined the Russian version of NATO, and started putting bases on our borders? What would we be doing? It's the next country. It's the Canada. It's the, they can't allow foreign powers to be the boss there. They just can't allow that, nor would we.
Yeah. Well, Charles, you've given us a lot of our listeners some food for thought. So thank you for giving us a different perspective on the Soviet Union and for talking to us about your program of education here.
My pleasure.
Okay. Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you.